We're very excited to hear words of Torah from our guest Darshan, the Honorable Seth Marnin. Judge Marnin, who is also a neighbor to us, not that far from us, lives in the Upper West Side and is a member of Anshe Chesed. Judge Marnin is the first openly transgender judge in the history of New York State. But it gets even better. It gets even better because he is the first transgender man in the history of the United States to serve as a judge. So, Judge Marnin also has served as a former board chair of Keshet and has been involved in the Jewish community and is here to really teach Torah. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. Okay?
Higher than it was before.
Yeah.
That's probably better. Shabbat Shalom. So first I want to say it gives me such joy to hear from youth who have been at a Keshet Shabbaton, having served as the board chair for 4.5 years.
How is the sound?
Not good.
Okay, so, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, so let's try this. I got it.
Yeah. Is this better? Okay. So far. Okay. So, great joy to hear.
Unfortunately, our mics have to sort of gobble that.
Got it. Okay. So this week's Parsha, Nasso, in fact, the longest Parsha of the year, clocking it at 176 verses, includes several seemingly unrelated themes. We begin, not so surprisingly, in the book of Numbers with counting. My goodness.
Just go with it.
I feel like Madonna, I don't know. So it begins with counting and it ends with listing the tribal chieftains and the gifts that they brought for the consecrating of the Mishkan. In between, we have the laws by which the sota, the suspected adulteress, is judged. We have the rules of the Nazir, the one who takes a vow to be a Nazirite, and the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing. There is, needless to say, a lot here. And while I have much to say about the laws of Sota and what it says about fragile masculinity, I'm going to leave that for another day. Instead, today I want to talk about the Nazirites. As I studied the Parsha, I was struck by the verses describing the Nazirite, an individual who, by a simple vow, takes on a special sacred status. This is voluntary. The Nazirite in the Parsha is not born into this role, as distinct from the Nazirites, who are born into it like Samson in the Haftarah, but instead they choose it purposely. For the period of the vow, 30 days or more, the Nazirite occupies this sacred space. They may not have contact with a dead body or consume any grape products, intoxicants or not, or cut their hair. And at the end of that period, the Nazirite is brought to the Mishkan to make a sin offering. These limitations are not unfamiliar. They are similar to the restrictions of the Kohanim, the priests. But in fact, the Nazirites' restrictions are even greater than the Kohanes. An ordinary Kohen is permitted contact with the dead of their immediate family. Only the high priest shares the Nazirite's absolute prohibition with contact with the dead. Kohanim are only prohibited from drinking intoxicants while on duty in the sanctuary, lest they meet the fate of Nadav and Avihu back in Parshat Shmini, but they are not prohibited from doing so at other times, nor are they forbidden from consuming non-alcoholic grape products. Finally, Kohanim were not allowed to shave their heads, but were required to trim their hair. So it appears that at least for the period of the vow, the Nazirite's sanctity and the burdens surpassed even that of the high priest. Interestingly, anyone, regardless of gender, including enslaved individuals, could make the vow. They just had to say the words, and Tractate Nazir seems to suggest you didn't even really have to say all the words, but you just had to sort of express that you had some intention with your words. There was much discussion by our sages concerning whether making the Nazirite vow was a good thing or a bad thing. Why, they asked, was a sin offering necessary at the conclusion? The Torah doesn't really say. I'm sure you'll not be surprised to learn that there was disagreement among the rabbis. To some, the Nazarite was worthy of praise. They voluntarily chose a higher level of holiness. And the reason a Nazarite had to bring a sin offering at the end of the period was because they were now returning to ordinary life. The sin was in ceasing to be a Nazarite. Other rabbis, however, held the opposite opinion. They believed the sin lay in becoming a Nazarite in the first place, thereby denying oneself some of the pleasures of the world God had created and declared good. I appreciate one rabbi's efforts to split the difference. He essentially used the placement of the text in the Parsha concerning the vows, sandwiched between the disturbing text of the Sota, the trials of the allegedly adulterous woman, and the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing, to conclude that there exist two types of Nazarites. One that takes on the vows to avoid adultery, that is, if you don't drink and cut your hair, you're not likely to get in trouble, and one that uses the vows as a springboard to holiness. The Nazarite was deemed one of the holy individuals of their generation, and served as a model and a teacher of the people. Whether it was good or bad to take the vow, I was struck by the juxtaposition of the Nazarite vow to the typical dynamic between the Israelites and God. In the Torah, the Israelites have very little autonomy when it comes to their relationship with God. We were chosen, but we did not necessarily choose. The Kohanim inherited their priesthood and had no choice. Even the prophets felt compelled to speak in God's name. It's all Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God said to Moses, tell the people. Abraham was chosen, Moshe was chosen, Aaron was chosen. While they may have complied or affirmed, none of them did the choosing. But here in Nasso, the individual chooses. By simply uttering a vow, you get to become a Nazarite. Anyone willing to accept the terms just had to raise their hand. So what is it that the Nazarites are doing? Quite simply, they are volunteering. They are raising their hands and saying, I am prepared to serve. So why am I talking about Nazarites on Pride Shabbat? Let me start with the profoundly challenging times we are in, particularly for LGBTQ people, our families, friends, and communities. The ACLU is presently tracking nearly 600 anti-LGBT bills around the country. And I want to be very clear and specific here. The majority of these bills, indeed nearly all of them, are anti-trans. They range from prohibiting trans girls and women from playing sports in some newfound commitment to girls and women, to refusing to allow trans folks to obtain accurate identification. They include censoring curricula, what teachers in our public schools may teach and what books may be on the shelves of our libraries. And of course, they include denying trans folks, particularly our youth, access to healthcare and criminalizing healthcare providers and young trans people's families for assisting them in obtaining medically necessary healthcare. The efforts to deny healthcare is particularly pernicious when we know its literal life-saving benefits. And this does not begin to touch on the myriad ways, large and small, that the executive branch is seeking to erase trans people's existence. Almost immediately after taking office, this administration wiped nearly all LGBTQ and HIV-focused content and resources from the White House website and from key federal agency web pages. The administration quickly moved to eliminate the ability of transgender people to obtain a passport that accurately reflects their identity, and moved transgender women who are incarcerated in women's prisons into men's prisons. The State Department's travel advisory website literally removed the T from LGBT and now only offers guidance to LGB travelers. Not to be outdone, the National Park Service removed transgender from the Stonewall National Monument website, despite the fact that it was transgender people who led the Stonewall Rebellion. In mid-May, the National Institutes of Health had canceled more than $600 million in research grants related to trans health, including slashing studies on what the administration described as transgender mice, even though these studies were designed to study the effect of hormones on disease, fertility, and HIV vaccine efficacy, which had little, in fact, nothing to do with so-called gender ideology. And this is despite the fact that scientists have for some time recognized that studies like these that involve trans folks help scientists think about and understand sex and gender in smarter ways for the betterment of the entire population. And to be clear, this is beyond the billions of dollars in federal research grants to universities that have been cut, wholly unrelated to LGBT people. And just this past week, the Navy was ordered to strip Harvey Milk's name from a ship, and transgender military personnel had until yesterday to voluntarily separate from service with an honorable discharge or wait to be forced out. Apparently, the administration's nod to Pride Month. These legislative assaults on our community are certainly not new. Indeed, for some time now, our Congress and legislatures around the country have introduced bills that are detrimental to us. Some of these bills became law, many more died in committee. But when they became law, they were challenged in courts. We could, by and large, rely on our judiciary to uphold the rule of law, recognize these new laws as unconstitutional, and expect that our states and the federal government would respect the decisions of our judges and justices. Some, no doubt, took longer than others, in some cases, much longer. Whether Lawrence versus Texas striking down sodomy laws in 2003, Windsor invalidating the Defense of Marriage Act in 2013, and Obergefell making marriage equality the law of our land in 2015, and even as recently as 2020, when our Supreme Court ruled that transgender and gay and lesbian people were protected by federal anti-discrimination law, the decisions were abided by. States granted marriage licenses, the federal government allowed us to file our tax returns, and employers around the country understood that they could be sued for discriminating against LGBT people. However, in this particular moment, we are confronted on a nearly daily basis with profound threats to the rule of law. It is, quite frankly, a daunting time to be a judge. Parties, including, if not especially the federal government, defy judicial orders, modeling noncompliance for other litigants. Judges, and even their families, are literally threatened when their decisions are perceived as biased, despite the fact that they are following the law. And we can no longer rely with any degree of confidence on our federal courts to, in Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's words, not flout clear precedent. That is, rely on the legal principles that we have depended on for decades. Yet here I am. I raised my hand to be a judge. I choose to be out as a transgender man. I say yes when asked to speak to high school students about my life and career. I raise my hand to meet with LGBT law students who are struggling with what it means to enter the profession in this moment, particularly as queer people. I say yes when asked to serve on the court's Permanent Commission on Access to Justice. I step up to educate my fellow judges on how to interact with trans people respectfully. And I say yes when asked to speak to my Jewish community on Pride Shabbat. It's not all doom and gloom. I have witnessed our Jewish LGBT youth emerge as leaders in both the Jewish and queer communities. I have seen allies, particularly parents of trans kids, most of them straight themselves, coming out as parents of queer kids. Unlike earlier generations, they're not trying to fix or change their children. Rather, they're raising their hands to occupy the front lines of battle on their children's behalf. And that gives me hope. Rabbi Sack, Zichrona Livracha, described volunteer work as an expression of shared responsibility for common good, personal engagement in pursuit of an ideal. He said it is active citizenship of the highest order. It softens the contours of random fate and tells us that not all compassion can be paid for by taxes and outsourced to government agencies. Indeed, volunteers have sustained the Jewish community for centuries, from educating our young to Bichur Cholim, visiting the sick, to our Chevra Kadisha, the volunteers who prepare our dead for burial. Jews have relied on volunteers. Generation after generation of Jews have provided for our community's essential needs. And beyond life cycle demands, we volunteer on synagogue boards, organizational boards of all kinds, in soup kitchens and homeless shelters, and in welcoming the ger, the stranger, helping refugees and asylees settle in this country. In the queer community, too, we and our allies have volunteered in myriad ways. That diverse group of African American, Latino, and white drag queens, transgender folks, gay men and a few lesbians, and some homeless youth stepped up in June of '69, and rather than acquiesce to the police abuse, they resisted. We have marched for our rights, tended to our dying, volunteered to lead our organizations, and serve as role model for our youth. Our communities, Jewish and queer, could not function without volunteers and volunteer leaders. We have long been sustained by voluntary collective responsibility, and I don't expect that to change anytime in the near future. Let me be perfectly clear. As daunting as the present circumstances are, now is not the time to retreat. To the contrary, it's time to raise our hands, perhaps higher than we have ever raised them, to volunteer, to be visible, to do this holy work, to ask ourselves, what hard things can I do? And to become more holy in doing the work. Shabbat Shalom and Pride Sameach.